Hi everyone, I'm Gwen. Welcome to my new channel.
On this channel, I will share my experiences, lessons, and stories to help everyone improve.
I hope you will support me. If you are here, you already know what this channel is about.
We do not talk about history the way history is usually taught, as dates, as names, as things that happened to other people in other times.
We talk about it the way it actually was. As lives.
As decisions made under pressure. As moments of fear and courage and love that happened to real human beings, long before any of us arrived. Today, I want to tell you a story that begins 75,000 years ago, on the southern coast of Africa, in a cave above the Indian Ocean. It is a story about a woman who understood something that most of us spend our whole lives failing to understand, that the most important thing you will ever do is not survive.
It is remember. And make sure someone else remembers after you are gone. Her name was Kaya.
And this is her story.
The coast was on fire. Not from flame. From the sky itself.
The sun hung low and angry over the Indian Ocean, bleeding copper and rust across the water. The wind came screaming in from the south, bending the ancient fig trees until their roots groaned in protest. And along the narrow ridge above the sea caves, where the rock met the air and the air met the storm, a woman stood completely still.
Her name was Kaya. She was old. Old enough that the younger hunters could not remember a time before her voice. Before her hands.
Before the stories she pressed into stone with fingers stained the color of dried blood.
She was the memory of the clan.
And standing there, watching the sky turn colors that had no name, she understood something the others had not yet understood. The memory was in danger.
She turned from the water and walked back into the cave.
Inside, 17 people moved with the controlled urgency of people who know that panic is a luxury only the already dead can afford.
Carrying frames were being loaded with dried meat and sealed water bladders. Bundles were being lashed to backs.
Children had already been guided to the back passage of the cave system, where the tunnel narrowed enough that even the wind could not follow.
But Kaya went none of those directions. She went to the wall.
It stretched nearly 4 body lengths wide and 2 high, a broad panel of cream-colored limestone that had absorbed the work of her hands, and her mother's hands, and her mother's mother's hands, across more years than any story in the clan could reach. Not a record of hunts, though hunts were there.
Not faces, though the abstract suggestion of faces could be found if you knew where to look. What covered the wall was something older and stranger than pictures. Zigzag lines that meant the movement of water.
Rows of crossed marks that meant the seasons of the great fish. And handprints, dozens of them, each one pressed in red ochre, the iron-rich earth mined from the hillside deposits for generation after generation after generation.
Each handprint was a life. A birth. A death. A first successful hunt. The choosing of a name.
Compressed into the shape of a hand and sealed in red earth against the stone. Scholars thousands of years later would call this place Blombos Cave. Researchers from the University of the Witwatersrand would excavate this site in the 1990s and find the ochre workshop abalone shells still stained with red paste, nodules of raw ochre, evidence of pigment processed with fat and bone marrow into a mixture that could be stored and applied with precision. They would find engraved ochre pieces.
Abstract geometric patterns scratched into the surface of red nodules with deliberate, repeated strokes.
They would call it the earliest known evidence of symbolic thought on Earth. Of a human mind making marks that meant something beyond the marks themselves. They would argue about it for centuries in their universities and journals.
Kaya did not know any of this. She knew only that the wall was the clan.
That if the wall was lost, the clan would eventually become something less than what they were.
Breathing. Hunting. Surviving.
But without the thing that made survival mean something.
Without the memory.
Without the story of themselves. She pressed her forehead against the limestone and held it there.
Then she stepped back.
And she made a decision. She crossed to the ochre workshop ledge, a flat shelf of rock at waist height where the flat abalone shells still held traces of mixed pigment. One shell still contained a thick smear of red paste. She picked it up and turned toward the 5 children huddled near the back passage opening. The children ranged from perhaps 4 years old to perhaps 11. They were watching her with the enormous, completely trusting eyes of children who have decided that the adult in front of them will handle whatever is happening. One by one, she took each child's right hand.
She pressed each small palm into the ochre paste until it was fully coated.
And then she guided each hand, firmly and carefully, to the section of clean limestone just to the right of the great panel, the section that had always been left bare. She pressed each hand against the stone and held it there until the print was set.
5 small handprints bloomed against the wall.
Vivid red against white.
Still wet. Glistening. 5 new lives added to the record in the final moments before whatever was coming arrived.
Outside, the sound had changed. The wind had dropped.
Completely. Suddenly. The eerie silence that precedes catastrophe settled over the cliff like a held breath.
And into that silence came something else, a low, sustained roar from the north, growing by the second.
Not thunder. Deeper than thunder.
The sound the earth makes when it decides to rearrange itself.
Kaya looked at the 5 fresh handprints one last time. Then she turned.
And she walked toward the back passage. And without any words needing to be said, the entire clan fell into line behind her.
Kaya first.
The 5 children close behind her. Then the adults, carrying everything they had been able to gather. The tunnel was dark and low and smelled of salt and old smoke. The roar from outside was now a physical pressure against the ears, a vibration in the chest wall.
They moved by feel. By memory.
Because Kaya had walked this passage in full darkness enough times to know every turn, every low ceiling, every place where the floor dipped toward a shallow puddle.
The tunnel opened onto a high ledge on the landward side of the cliff.
They emerged into a strangely dim afternoon, the light yellowish, underwater, as if the sky itself had thickened. To the north, the horizon had disappeared entirely behind a wall of something that was not cloud and not smoke and not rain but all three at once.
17 people stood on that ledge.
5 of them with small red-stained right hands. They stood for one long moment, looking at what was coming. Then Kaya began to walk inland.
And without a word, they all followed.
They walked for 3 days.
The catastrophe, what coastal researchers would later identify as the consequence of a massive submarine landslide triggering inundation waves along the South African coast, reshaped the cliff face entirely.
But the cave was not destroyed.
It was sealed.
A collapse of the upper cliff face brought down enough limestone to partially block the entrance, burying the ochre workshop, the engraved pieces, the handprint panel, under a protective layer of debris, where it would remain, undisturbed, for 75,000 years.
The clan did not know this. They knew only that their home was gone. So they built a new one. 3 weeks of travel inland brought them to a river valley.
Green and sheltered, strange to their eyes but structurally familiar.
Fig trees. Herds of antelope at the water. Overhanging rock faces that could be converted into shelter with branch and skin, the same technique they had always used. And limestone. The eldest child found it first. She was 11 years old, and her name was Amma, and she found a pale, broad face of cream-colored rock along the eastern wall of the valley. Smooth and clean and approximately the right height for a person to reach their full arm span across. She brought Kaya to it the next morning. The 2 of them stood before it in the early light. The old woman and the child. The child's right hand was still faintly stained, the red ochre faded now to a brownish pink, barely visible against her skin, but still there if you looked. Kaya reached into the small pouch she wore against her body. The one she had packed before anything else. Before food. Before water. Before tools. Inside, 5 nodules of raw ochre from the hillside deposits above Blombos. And 1 flat abalone shell, scrubbed clean. She placed the shell on a flat rock. She placed a nodule of ochre in it. She looked at the child. And then she began to grind. The paste formed slowly under her thumb, spreading across the shell's surface in a vivid, impossible red. Amma watched without speaking. When the paste was ready, Kaya took the child's right hand, the hand with the faded mark still on it, and she lowered it, open-palmed, into the ochre.
Then she guided it to the new wall. A hand pressed flat against the clean cream stone.
Fingers spread wide. Palms centered. And the handprint bloomed. A single small mark. Vivid and red.
On a wall that had never been touched before, in a valley the clan had never seen before, made by a child who had been taught that this was the most important thing she would ever do. The memory did not die in the storm.
It moved. It pressed itself into new stone and kept going, the way it had always kept going.
From hand to wall, the child to hand to wall, stretching forward through time in the only form that survives everything.
Not as objects. Not as places. As the stubborn, unkillable human need to say, I was here. We were here. We existed, and we mattered, and we ask you not to forget us. When the excavation teams reached Blombos Cave in the late 20th century, they found what Kaya had left behind. The workshop.
The engraved pieces. The handprints pressed in red ochre against cream limestone by people whose names we will never know, in a language we cannot read, at a moment we can only imagine. 75,000 years of silence between the pressing of those hands and the first modern eyes to see them. What the researchers could not recover, because it was never written, because it lived only in the chain of mouths and ears and hands that carried it forward, was what it felt like to be standing in that cave. To be the person pressing a child's hand into red earth in the last moments before catastrophe.
To be saying, with every ounce of remaining calm, remember this. Carry this forward. Find a new wall.
But you do not need the researchers to tell you what that felt like.
You already know. Because you are here.
Because somewhere in the very long and almost impossibly fragile chain of people who refused to let the story end, someone made that choice. Someone picked up the memory and ran with it into the dark. And after a journey of unimaginable length and difficulty and loss, that chain reached forward across 75,000 years.
And arrived at you. The handprint on the wall was never just a handprint.
It was a door, left open across an almost incomprehensible distance of time.
And you walked through it. Thank you for watching.
If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true in a way you were not expecting, then share it with someone.
Because that is exactly what Kaya would have done. See you in the next one.
Thanks for watching. Smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe for more nostalgia. And hit the bell. Never miss an episode.